This is episode 426 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Carol Wight. She is the executive director of the New Mexico Restaurant Association, an organization which was at the forefront of attempting to get changes made during COVID, and one of the industries that was most impacted by COVID. And of course, now we have a variety of laws and other things like inflation that are impacting your industry. But we'll talk about all of that in our conversation. Welcome back, Carol.
Thank you so much, Paul. Good to be here.
Yeah, and thanks for all that you do to try to improve and keep one of New Mexico's important but often overlooked industries as healthy as possible. And, you know, COVID still kind of continues to be in the background. New Mexico's, of course, in a state of emergency. But in many ways, your industry is picking up the pieces from the COVID pandemic. So let's talk about that to begin with. What is the situation with New Mexico's restaurants, more or less post COVID-19?
Well, just to kind of go back, I did just recently get the real numbers from the Taxation Revenue Department for the restaurant losses, and it looks like we lost over 1,000 restaurants, 1,093 to be exact. And
Now, how would you calculate that? Just to jump in real quick on
no,
that.
sir, certainly because I think it's important to look at this. So we looked at the December of 2019, the number of restaurant locations that were reporting gross receipts tax. And then we looked at 2021, the number of restaurants that were December that were reporting gross receipts tax, and that was 1,093 less. For full service restaurants, for the accommodations and food service industry, it was even more than that. It was about 1,700 losses.
Yeah, and I would expect that if you are not paying GRT to the state of New Mexico, you're either not in business or you won't be in business very long, and you may wind up having three hots and a cot in a very secure facility. So I think that's a pretty good way to frame that data. So that's a lot of restaurants. Do you know at all how many restaurants, give or take, do business in New Mexico in any given time period?
Well, prior to 2019, it was about around 5,000, 4,500 to 5,000. And in the case of 2019, it was 5,700 and growing at that point. And then obviously we've shrunk. And again, that percentage was 18% that we lost, which is much higher than the national average. I think the national average is still 10%.
Okay, well, 10% still nothing to sneeze at, but obviously here in New Mexico, we were more locked down by Governor Lujan Grisham. We had more restrictions on restaurants and a variety of other behaviors than in many other states, and it just, I'm sure, a very difficult place to do business. So, I guess I'll ask you at this point, what are your efforts to address that issue? I mean, obviously, you're not going to bring home some of our favorite restaurants. I mean, my kids, for one, still complain about sweet tomatoes going over the river, over the Rainbow Bridge, so to speak. That's kind of a chain buffet outfit, but there's the Rock and Brews place here in Albuquerque. I mean, you could name off restaurant after restaurant that shut down largely due to the pandemic. You're not going to bring those folks back, but what's your association working to do to help the restaurants that exist moving forward?
So, I mean, we're doing everything we can to help them. Specifically, up until now, we've really been working with them on some of the federal and the state relief that's been available. And right now we're specifically asking them to make sure that they're taking advantage of the employee retention tax credit, which is something that any business in New Mexico qualifies for because of how shut down we were. And it's a significant amount of money, up to $26,000 per employee. So there's numerous businesses, including restaurants, who have not taken advantage of that and need to apply for that. And you can go back and apply. You don't have to. You didn't miss out yet.
And this is a federal
That's
thing?
a federal,
Okay.
yeah, a federal tax credit. So it's money in the bank.
Okay.
And for a lot of these small businesses, it's upwards of $100,000.
Now, I don't need you to go into all the details of how people might get that, but any websites that they could go to if they happen to be involved with a restaurant? Do you know offhand where do they go?
Our website, nmrestaurants.org, is the best place for them to go. We have partnered with a group that's helping people get these tax credits. I mean, it's something you could do yourself, but it's fairly complicated, and so easier to go through it with somebody who knows what they're doing. And we've got a great company that's helping folks, and the IRS is taking multiple months to get this money back in people's hands, and so they'll even give you a loan for the money if you need it.
And I suppose I'll offer my disclaimer here. While the Rio Grande Foundation is not a fan of government spending at any level, the fact is that the federal government did not federal government, sorry, the state governments did shut these restaurants down. Now, I personally believe that it's more up to the states to provide this kind of relief, but we know that the federal government has passed many stimulus packages. Many people have cashed checks. I cashed my check, so I'm not above taking the government handout. And my business was, quite frankly, not shut down. So let's move to the state level. What, if anything, is our state government, which, as Senate Finance Committee Chair George Munoz said before the last session, they have more money than they know what to do with. And I think he's going to have to come up with a new turn of phrase, because we're going to have even more money than they know what to do with before the next session. But has the state been as magnanimous in their approach to restaurants as the feds?
I'm going to say yes and no. We did get 4 months of gross receipts tax relief in the form of a rebate. So restaurants in 2021, as we were coming out of the pandemic, for March through July, could take advantage of a gross receipts tax credit. And many of them did. And interestingly, a lot of restaurants have not done this yet. And they carved out fast food restaurants. So really, restaurants that did well through the pandemic didn't get this gross receipts tax relief, but other full service restaurants did. And that was the big one, I think, that was specifically for the restaurant industry. There was a couple of other rounds of ARPA funds that every business in New Mexico got, maybe $10,000, maybe $5,000. It was not a lot of money. And then they tried to do some things like LEDA funds and loan funds that were questionable. I mean, there was federal money literally for nothing. And so some of these state funds they weren't as credible as and available as the federal funds. Mm-hmm. So right now, actually, we are going to the legislature and saying, for those folks that did not get the federal Restaurant Revitalization Fund, which that fund basically made restaurants whole, for those folks that did not get that fund, we're asking for the state to come up with a fund of its own. There were 928 restaurants that did not get that. Out of 1,500 restaurants, 600 did get it, 900 did not get it. And so we're asking for them to help make those 900 restaurants whole.
All right. Now,
and I know you guys don't agree
I understand.
that, but this is the state that shut us down. This is the state that should help us out, especially when they have more money than they know what to do with.
Right. So rebates are, there's something, and we've got a lot of talk going on about rebates at the kind of broader state level with the governor's rebates going out to taxpayers. Mark Ronchetti planning an annual rebate package if he is elected. We've talked at some length at the Rio Grande Foundation about the pluses and minuses of rebates. Now, is there any discussion at all in Santa Fe, even a bill possibly, to exempt all restaurants from GRT on their food sales to customers? It'd be kind of like making the rhetoric of being anti-food tax accurate, because a lot of people use the phrase, I'm against reinstating the food tax. Well, it's not a food tax. It's a tax on groceries, and there's a lot of little nuances there. But what do you think about exempting all GRT on restaurant food sales? Is that too ambitious, too self-centered for your industry to try?
Well, every other industry has done this, and that's why we have the Swiss cheese gross receipts tax that we do. And that's why it's not a broad tax anymore. Honestly, I think that we need to look at the gross receipts tax. I know that Santa Fe would not go for that, only because in some communities, restaurants are the only businesses actually paying gross receipts tax. So, when they took away the groceries in the grocery stores, that really hurt some of the smaller communities because they just didn't have anybody paying gross receipts tax. For them to consider that for restaurants too, I think is more than we're going to get out of the legislature. But if you think about it, at the time that they took the gross receipts tax off of groceries, gross receipts tax across the state was anywhere 5-6%, and now it's upwards of 9-10%. And restaurants, you go to a restaurant, you have to pay for your meal, and then you put a tip on top of that, and then you have to pay the gross receipts tax, and now some restaurants are even having to put a surcharge on because we have inflation, wholesale food inflation of about 18%.
Well, I definitely want to talk about that because it's kind of been out of the frying pan and into the fire for your industry, and that's both from a policy standpoint here in New Mexico, but also the the inflation situation. So, talk about how that has impacted your industry. And I've been in restaurants where they've had inflation surcharges, not here in New Mexico, but in some other states. How are they dealing with these higher costs, and what are the things that are driving those costs?
Well, it's interesting. It's a little bit of everything. I mean, everything from glass. So for a while, people couldn't get glass. People couldn't get tequila in their bars because they couldn't get the glass to put the tequila in. And that's a tragedy in Mexico, right?
Man, that's a. It seems just bizarre to me that you would have a product as complicated and it requires aging and it can be expensive in a lot of circumstances, but the problem's the glass.
Right. Well, same thing with beans. For a while they couldn't find the bags for the beans. They had the beans, they had the people to ship the beans. They just didn't have the bags for the beans to go in. So it's and then paper goods are hard to get in some cases. It's just one thing after another. Here, listen to this. So I was sitting with some restaurateurs the other day, and they were actually talking to Congress, and a case of chicken wings prior to the pandemic cost about $42. And so we have all of our menus priced at this price point. Now that same case of chicken wings is $192. And restaurants are very timid about raising their prices. They're just, every time we raise prices, we lose customers. Mm-hmm. And so it's this back and forth of how do I do this without raising my prices? and how do I not lose customers? And you hear customers all the time talk about how, well, we're just, the family just won't go out, you know, either once a month or twice a month or whatever. We used to go out. We just won't do that. We'll buy groceries instead. That's not good for us.
Yeah, and you're truly in a catch-22 because you eventually do have to raise prices if the prices you're paying go up. But on the other hand, there's no question. I mean, despite what Joe Biden says, we are in a recession. And just because employment is strong, and we're going to talk about employment and the search for talent at restaurants, but it is a different kind of recession when employment numbers are strong. But when your purchasing power is being eaten away so aggressively by the money printing in Washington and by the inflation of everything that we buy, that is going to kick in various industries like yours. So what are you finding, or what are you talking to these restaurants? Are they trying to get by and large without raising costs, or how much are they able to raise costs? I know it's tough across an entire industry, but if you have any anecdotes, that would be even good.
Well, for a while, I was really pushing the surcharge because it's a way for restaurants to put a surcharge on for now while prices are high and then take it off later. So it's not, and it gets it on every single item. Even if it's a 3% surcharge, it's very expensive to print menus, which is another reason we hate to raise prices. In a grocery store, they can change that sticker out pretty quick, and they do every day. When a price goes up, the price goes up at the grocery store.
And you notice it. I mean,
yeah,
it's clear that the grocery stores, whoever it is not being shy about raising prices. I mean, I don't assume that they aren't being impacted as directly as any other industry, but they do. You're right. They have a lot more flexibility. They can switch the UPC symbol and what that stands for very quickly. But yeah, menus alone are expensive.
You can't find anybody to help you in a grocery store. And of course, we have loads of employees in a restaurant. So our costs for employees have gone up as well, as you have alluded to. With fewer employees, we're having to pay the ones that come in more. And especially those folks that have been with us forever, they're the ones who are showing up on a daily basis, and everybody's tired. And you're seeing it, restaurants have said, we have to close at certain times. And I just heard today that restaurants aren't just closing because they can't get employees. They're also closing because of the crime, especially here in Albuquerque. They're not going to put their employees at risk at some of those late night times.
Well, just more issues, right?
I wish I had some good news, and I guess I kind of do. There's folks out there that have food trucks that are starting up and going into brick and mortar buildings. So we've got some good things happening, but it's taking a long time, and people are really restaurants are really struggling still.
Now, let's talk about workforce, and we'll eventually get to crime too. But
you're just like all.
you're laying out the breadcrumbs for me along this path here. But Rio Grande Foundation was we were just looking at workforce participation. The Albuquerque Journal finally, I'm no offense to the Albuquerque Journal, but the mainstream media doesn't either have the resources or the wherewithal to look at some of these critical questions. Now, we know New Mexico has the highest unemployment rate in the nation and has for 7 months running. It's a relatively low unemployment rate by historical standards. It's 4.9% in June. But our workforce participation rate, as the Journal rightly pointed out, and we've pointed out repeatedly, really is problematic. Now, I'll just go through this real quick, as quickly as possible. So in the current situation in Colorado, they are at 67.1% workforce participation rate. They actually started the pandemic at 66.6, or January of 2020. Utah, 66.7, and now they're back to 66.7. Uh, Arizona, 61.4 is where they started. 61.2 is where they are now. So 0.2 of a percentage point decline there. And then Oklahoma and I'm sorry, that was Texas, and then Oklahoma and Arizona, 59% basically, still at 59%. We had the biggest drop in our workforce participation among any state in the region, and we were lower when we started at 55.6% workforce participation, dropping 1.2 to 54.2. Now, that's all a bit of a lengthy and data intensive way to say there are jobs available in your industry and in other industries. And for whatever reason, New Mexicans in particular seem unwilling to take a lot of those jobs. Is this, something that you can see being driven by given particular policies, or what's going on here from the Restaurant Association and restaurants' eyes?
You know, it's a huge mystery. Everybody is like, where are the people? Where did they go? And we know we lost a lot of folks during the pandemic because we were surrounded by states that were still working. So if people wanted to work and they were able to move because they didn't have a job they were sticking to, they moved, and especially if they were on a border city, they moved to those states. So Texas, Arizona, Colorado all got a lot of our really good folks. We know that. Of course, we were doing the census just right before all of this happened. So, and in the middle of it. So I don't know if that got captured necessarily. The other thing, Paul, I was thinking, and I don't know how much this made a difference, but there was a long list of New Mexicans on a disability list that had not been funded. And I know that during the legislative session, one of them, we did fund enough to get those people off of that disability list. So I wonder if some of those were employed prior to this and are not employed anymore. I don't know. We're looking for them. We're trying to find out where they are. We actually have a fabulous program for high school students called ProStart.
Right.
And we're using that as much as possible to get some workforce. We worked very closely with the Workforce Solutions Department for a program in Carlsbad, New Mexico, that netted about 100 students coming out of high school into the hospitality industry. And if you think about Carlsbad, they're desperate for these hospitality workers because they have so many vacationers coming in to see the caverns, but then they're also the hospitality industry is competing with the oil and gas industry there for jobs, and so it's been touch and go for the hospitality industry in that area for a long time, and they can actually help us, with the rest of the state because they've been dealing with this same scenario where they did not have hospitality workers, and now it's the rest of the state is dealing with that as well. And again, like you said, and like I like to say, it's not just the restaurant industry, it is every industry is having a hard time finding workers. And I will tell you that, somebody told me the other day that they had interviews with, I think it was 30 people, and only one person showed up for the interview.
Wow.
They had 30 interviews scheduled and only one person showed up.
I could tell you my 12-year-old and 10-year-old would love to jump into the workforce now, and I'm not going to ask you to advocate against child labor laws, but they would love to go work at the Starbucks down the street or Chick-fil-A or what whoever they could get a job with. I told them, sorry, you guys have to wait until I think 15 or 16, and
we'll take them at 15. We can't work them past a certain time. We know the laws.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just speculate with me. I mean, we have always had this issue. And is the disability list you mentioned, is that SSDI? Is that the same as the federal government's, or is this a state disability list? Because the journal mentioned that essentially, it was 20 years, the disability list of SSDI recipients, and it's very tough to go from not, from on disability, not difficult. People rarely have the incentive if they wanted to get off of SSDI to get off of SSDI. I'm not saying it's all about incentives, but it is to an extent. Is that, or is there a state program specifically dealing with that you're
I'm pretty
to?
sure I was hearing about a state program, and it's not something, it's not a program I deal with ever.
Uh-huh.
But it just came to mind the other day that we were that I believe New Mexico used some of their money to get people off of that state. It must be a state disability list, and maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know.
Yeah, it just it seems very, very odd that yes, we have a lot of challenges right now in the workforce, and there's a few more that I want to talk about, but with so many jobs available, and let's face it, I don't know how many restaurants out there, maybe you can tell me, but we just became legal in New Mexico as of April 1st. I think down the list of drug testing industries is really restaurants is way down there. I'm not saying every pothead needs to go find a job at a restaurant, but let's be fair here. Workforce participation rate in the Mountain West: Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas. Who has the highest rate? 7.1% in Colorado, and they've had legalized weed. So clearly, marijuana by itself has not caused every Colorado. In fact, maybe there's an element of young people moving to Colorado, bumping up that rate because the young people are more interested in working. I don't know, just a hypothesis. Anyway, all right, well, on July 1st, speaking of laws that have taken effect in New Mexico, you had another one dumped on you, as in this industry, which is the mandatory paid sick leave. And that one kind of worked its way through the system. It was delayed for a year due to COVID, but July 1st of 2022, every industry, every business with one person and more or more has to provide certain levels of mandatory paid sick leave. Now, there's never a good time for additional government regulation, and that's why it got bumped back by a year. I think a lot of people thought we were going to be, if not happy times are here again, everybody out of the pandemic, woohoo, let's go out and party and spend the money that we saved over the last 2 years at our local restaurants, that there was at least going to be a real positive vibe in our economy. And I would say that has not happened. So how is this policy, how is this law that the governor really championed having an impact?
Well, excuse me. I will say people were basically, even though we've been telling them for months and months about this, they were floored. I mean, just unbelievable. They would call me on a daily basis and say, Carol, is this true? I'm like, yes, it's true. And we've been telling you this. Oh, I just wasn't paying attention. I just didn't see the newsletter, and so really, I've got to say, and then when they figured out what it was they had to do to comply, they were really more depressed than anything, because it's just, oh my God, one more thing you're throwing at me when I'm dealing with no employees or few employees and prices going crazy, and I can't raise my prices. So it was more than they could handle in a lot of cases. We had a webinar with the Workforce Solutions Department, and I've got to say they were good about giving us the information, but what my members needed was a sample policy that they could just start with and then make it their own. And they were a little callous on this webinar and said, that's not our job. You need to talk to your lawyer and get your lawyer to put together a policy for you. Well, I told them, these folks are small businesses. They don't have a lawyer on call, and they certainly don't have somebody they can pay $2,000 to put a policy together for them. So it would be really nice if the government that is requiring them to do this could put together a policy and make sure that it complies with your law. Because basically what they're telling them is, we're not going to tell you if your policy complies. You're going to have to get a lawyer, and if that lawyer is wrong and you get a policy that does not comply, we will make sure that you pay the price, basically. So I don't know. I've been disappointed in government before, but certainly this was a huge disappointment, and these people didn't need that at this moment in their careers.
And your industry is certainly one of those that faces the greatest challenge in providing that kind of benefit to its workers. If you could just remind people who maybe forgot or haven't listened to the podcast why that's the case.
So interestingly, if you work in an office and you're sick for the day, your work doesn't get done. You come back, you do twice the amount of work. But if so your employer doesn't necessarily have to get somebody to replace you for that shift. In a restaurant, we have to replace you for that shift, which means we have to have enough workers to replace everybody who's calling in sick, and you don't have to call in sick ahead of time. In this law, you can call in, just right before you're going to be gone, and it can be for almost any reason. So, it's just more difficult for restaurants. So now I've got to get somebody to replace this person on this shift. And if I don't, the people that are there have to do twice the amount of work while they're there. It can't wait until tomorrow. And I think that's the big thing. And then the cost. We have a lot of employees. We have a lot of employees that may take advantage of this sick leave, whether they are sick or not, whether their family members are sick or not. And I think that's the biggest fear that employers have, is that they'll end up on Friday nights without a crew, because, our industry is known for wanting to go out on Friday nights. And so, or they won't have a crew on Saturday morning because everybody went out on Friday night. So it's more complicated than people wanted to make it. And we tried to ask them to put some parameters on this for businesses over 50 people. Help us out here, because these folks are really small businesses and they're doing the best they can.
Yeah. Again, Debbie Downer here. So
Don't.
I'm going to be the Debbie Downer, because
okay.
I'll bring
do it.
I'll bring back the crime issue. That's obviously a heavily Albuquerque oriented issue for many folks. I'm looking at a February 17th of this year, Garcia's Kitchen targeted by vandals, but it's not just stealing the copper off the building after hours. It's potential violence towards customers outside of restaurants, inside of restaurants. People don't want to go to certain parts of town. And then, theft and stuff inside restaurants. Talk about the crime issue as it impacts restaurants, especially here in Albuquerque.
I have been absolutely floored at the stories that I've heard from restaurants, the things that they've had to deal with. And it's not just them, but it's their employees are having to deal with this. And think about it. So a homeless person comes into the restaurant, makes a beeline for the bathroom, locks themselves in, and then doesn't ever come out.
And by the way, Starbucks recently shut down a number of their stores in some big liberal cities. Almost expected some Albuquerque stores to be on there. And I don't know if you talk to folks at Starbucks, they're kind of a restaurant, but this is a real issue. And anybody who's been through a drive-through in certain parts of town, or even in a restaurant, you see the quote unquote homeless in there, walking through drive-through windows, harassing people inside, outside restaurants. I mean, I'm 6'3" and I can handle myself, but there's a lot of people who are a lot smaller and maybe a little more timid who don't want to deal with it, so they just stay home.
Well, I mean, think about it. A woman may not be safe, and I have restaurateurs calling me. What can I do about this? I've got this happening, and I really need somebody to pay attention to it. And there is nothing. You know, uh, Many times restaurants are not reporting crimes anymore because as they report crimes to the city tells them that they are being if they continue to report crimes at that address, they will be considered a nuisance property. So you just stop reporting the crimes. And then the city has the gall to come after those businesses and say, you've got too much crime happening at your business. And it's the city's fault. I mean, it's because you won't send the police out. It's because we don't have any control on these folks, and we need some control. And so it's a huge problem. It's not that huge. It's like somebody needs to arrest some folks. I'm, you know, I'm tired of it. I'm actually forming a committee with the restaurants in the city to do what we can about it. And honestly, they've made it such a complicated problem without any solutions that it's overwhelming.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I see a series of articles from mid-May of this year about Albuquerque's Asian-owned businesses in particular. I assume that means restaurants, but they had a good neighbor program to check up on shops and restaurants to help address crime. And you hate to see any race or ethnic group targeted by crime, but it would seem that every restaurant, especially in certain parts of town, is a target these days for crime and the kind of behavior that makes it far less attractive for customers to go into those places and do business. So, any positive news? Anything we want to talk about in the last few minutes? You can throw more bad news at us, but obviously there's an election in November. I guess that's the most positive thing we can take away at this point is if voters care enough, they will have someone else heading pulling the levers of power, and I mean that in the House of Representatives, the Attorney General, the governor, etc. But that's a thin read indeed. So let's see what we can give people.
So I will say that since we've lost the masks, people have become nicer to each other. Isn't that interesting, Paul?
Shocking,
right? I am a big believer now that the masks really it made us yell at each other. Right. So
sometimes just to be heard and understood, but
most of the time, no. And
right.
so, but you get that when you're yelling at somebody, you start feeling that anxiety, right? And so then they're yelling back at you, and all of a sudden you're in a fight that never would have happened if you didn't have a mask on. And so we're seeing a lot of that subside, which is good. That we don't have the mask situation anymore, and I am all for it. If you have a reason to wear a mask, please wear a mask, and nobody should tell you not to. But I think coming back the other way, let's just be more civil about everything.
Yeah, well, that's an easy thing to say and advocate for, and I agree with you 100%. And certainly, restaurants, airlines, some of those industries that were most impacted by those mask mandates had to bear the brunt. But we're in an election time. This governor has very little interest in, I think, backtracking on COVID. She's on Twitter and on social media, and nary a mask to be found these days. And you can make what you will of the numbers, but heck, the president had COVID twice in a couple of weeks. So COVID is still out there, but I shudder to think what could happen if we had a sudden uptick this winter if she were to be in office. So who knows? I don't know. Maybe we are past the madness of the mask, but I don't know what that really means in terms of post-election politics. But yeah, if people want to find out more about the New Mexico Restaurant Association, where can you send them again?
nmrestaurants.org.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time and your advocacy for one of these great industries in New Mexico, and would love to get a true food tax exemption. I know that's maybe more my hill to die on than yours, but
no, I'll die on it too.
All right.
I'll be right up there with you.
What we definitely need to completely reform the gross receipts tax, and I'm not as into the morality of, well, we should tax groceries or not groceries. I bet you if you went back and did an analysis, and I'm not sure if we have the time or resources, but people at the lower income scales probably spend at least as much of their income as a percentage on restaurants as people at the very higher ends of their income scales. So, you could certainly make the point that keeping the tax on restaurants is a regressive tax. I'm not sure that's going to fly very far with the progressives, but the progressives don't have to control this state from here to kingdom come. So with that, we'll leave it right there. And thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube and Rumble channels. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.